Hello, my name is William Yu, and I teach American Religious and Cultural History at Columbia Seminary. I think in studying the Presbyterian past, I found a lot to be grateful for and a lot to repent of. And I think what's been exciting, but also bewildering and fascinating and frustrating to me, is studying more closely the contributions of Presbyterians of color. For example, the first ordained Native American to Protestant ministry was way back in 1759, and it was a Presbyterian, the Long Island Presbytery. After too many years of deliberating and debating whether someone of Indian descent, an American Indian, could become a minister, they ordained Samson Occam. And much of his writing reflects on the discrimination that he and his people and other indigenous inhabitants received, not only at the hands of the colonial government, but at the hands of Christian missionaries. And I think these are important stories for us to examine, to listen more carefully. Not so much that we need to disregard or throw away the contributions, the successes, the failures of those white male Presbyterian theologians and pastors who were influential for better and for worse in the making of American Presbyterianism. But if we could also look alongside with them, the yearning, the crying out for justice, the incisive criticism, both of the United States at large and the church. And if we can listen to those voices and hold these contributions and hold these arguments in tension with one another, I think that can help us today to produce a better and more authentic Christian witness.
Hello, everyone. I'm so glad that you've been able to join us. Welcome to this second First Friday faculty lecture. Last month, for the first Friday faculty lecture, Dr. Brennan Breed spoke, and we're so pleased that Dr. William Yu is going to be lecturing to us today. I'm really happy to see how many people are on the call. I hope that you are able to continue in this wonderful new tradition. We are living in very unusual and disquieting times. I know that many of you have seen this prayer for the pandemic. It's made the rounds, but it really is so appropriate for us to join our hearts together in prayer now. Let us pray. May we who are merely inconvenienced remember those whose lives are at stake. May we who have no risk factors remember those most vulnerable. May we who have the luxury of working from home remember those who must choose between preserving their health or making their rent. May we who have the flexibility to care for our children when their schools close remember those who have no options. May we who have to cancel our trips remember those that have no safe place to go. May we who are losing our margin money in the tumult of the economic market remember those who have no margin at all. May we who settle in for a quarantine at home remember those who have no home. As fear grips our country, let us choose love. During this time when we cannot physically wrap our arms around each other, let us yet find ways to be the loving embrace of God to our neighbors. Amen. Folks, I'm very happy to pass the baton now to my colleague, Dean Brandon Maxwell.
Thank you, President Van Dyke. So, hello, everyone. As President Van Dyke mentioned, my name is Brandon Maxwell. I serve as the Dean of Students and Vice President for Enrollment and Student Affairs here at Columbia. And welcome to First Friday. We have a different format today. If you were here at the last First Friday, we had a Zoom meeting, and today we're in a Zoom webinar format. So I'm sad that I can't see all of your faces in the same way, but we figured this would be a format that would allow us to streamline things a bit more and make sure that videos aren't jumpy at the beginning However, I see your names, and I see the names of some of our incoming students, Amazing Grace, Catherine Moore, Morgan Berg. It's good to see all of your names and so many others. I see some soon-to-be alumni even. I see you out there. It's good to see you, see your name at least and know that you're here with us. And I see some alums coming from around the world. I see Colleen Cook. I see Sarah Smith coming from Northern Ireland, and I see some fun staff people who I love, who I haven't seen in a while, but it's good to see your name. Sarah Erickson, David Logeman, Matt Rich. Welcome to First Fridays. This is a new initiative on the part of our admissions office. So thanks to Sam White, Matt Rich, and the entire admissions team for putting these together. I want to remind everyone who's on the webinar today that we have extended, if you're an alumni and you are thinking about further education, we have extended our application deadlines for all degree programs. If you're interested in a master's level program, you can apply through June the 30th, and there is still financial aid available. And if you're interested in the D-Min or the D-Admin program, our deadline for Gospel and Culture for that track in the D-Min is May 30th, and our deadline for the Church and Ministry track in the D-Min program is August the 1st. The deadline for the D-Admin program is also August the 1st, I believe. So if you have any questions or concerns or want to figure out how you can begin an application, reach out to us at admissions@ctsnet.edu, and we'll be glad to help. The primary purpose for our time today is to hear from Dr. William Yu. As I mentioned already, we're in a webinar format today, and so we won't have the ability to put people on the screen or to field questions live. But if you look in the bottom of the screen, you should see a button that says Q&A. If you click there, you'll be able to submit your question, and you can submit the question there, and it'll begin to form a queue. And Sam White, again, our Director of Admissions and Recruitment, is on the back end, and he will be fielding those questions and putting them into a neat, succinct order for us to respond to. Sorry about that. For us to respond to in the time of questions and answers. So that's Sam waving at you up top if you can see him. But for now, I'll hand it over to Katie Ricks, who will get us started with our lecture for the day.
God, I had to press unmute. Good afternoon, all. I am so glad that you are here with us today. I graduated from Columbia back in 2002, and one of the greatest gifts we had then, and we still have today, is an amazing faculty that is consistently on the cutting edge of research and exploration, and as well as being deeply involved in the vocational discernment and lives of our students. I had the gift of studying with Dr. Brueggemann and Dr. Yoder, Dr. Gonzalez and Dr. Riggs, Dr. Carter-Florence and Dr. Saunders. Some of those amazing people I have the privilege of serving with today in my current work here at Columbia. And I can attest to the fact that Columbia has continued to seek out the same quality and engaged faculty as time goes on. You had the pleasure of hearing Dr. Breed last month, and you will have the gift of hearing Dr. Lisa Weaver, the Assistant Professor of Worship, at our next First Friday faculty lecture on June 5th. Today, though, is all about Dr. William Yu, Assistant Professor of American Religious and Cultural History. If you do not consider yourself a history buff now, you will after today's lecture. Dr. Yu's scholarship, enthusiasm, and commitment to understanding where the church has been in order that we might know where we are going will captivate you and spark your interest in learning more. In addition to his beloved presence in the classroom, Dr. Yu is a strong advocate for our students, checking in with the student affairs staff regularly and participating in almost every community life event we hold. He can be found playing basketball and volleyball, as well as bringing his own shoes to the bowling alley each fall for our community-wide bowling bash. There might even be a video floating around YouTube still of Dr. Yu and a student trash talking one another about one of those bowling bashes a couple years back. It is humorous for sure, but more importantly, it is a testament to the way in which Dr. Yu is deeply integrated into the life of this community. Therefore, it is with great excitement that I introduce to you Dr. William Yu and his lecture today, Don't Let It Go, Why Church History Matters Today.
Thank you, Reverend Ricks. Hello, all. So in the first Frozen movie, there's a pivotal moment where Elsa, Queen Elsa, although she's not queen quite yet, is leaving her castle in Arendelle, and she's singing the song Let It Go. And one of the lines in that song is, "The past is in the past." But what she discovers in the second movie, I'm going to try to do this without spoilers. I want to be sensitive to those who have yet to travel into the unknown. But she discovers that the past is not necessarily only in the past. The past is in the present of Arendelle, and she is haunted by Arendelle's unjust encounters with the indigenous community that neighbors their kingdom. And so with that, we too in the United States and the church and the world at large, we too wrestle with the past. And we too recognize that the past is not necessarily only in the past, but it reverberates into our present. And I'd like to demonstrate in these next few minutes how the past reverberates into our present on the topics of race and politics, looking at past divides and disagreements among Christians, with some but not all focus on Presbyterians and what that meant for them then and what that means for us today. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. I have a few slides and then I will come back. Right, does everyone see the slideshow okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So Dr. Joyce Appleby, a longtime history professor at UCLA, who was the president of the AHA, American Historical Association, in 1997. She entitled her address, "The Power of History." And in some ways, it was a marvelous and innovative address for the ways in which she did not delve necessarily into academic historic minutiae, but she really argued for the cultural, social, and political relevance of American historians, for the work that they did and what it how it mattered for the world at large. And so she argues that history is powerful because we live with its residues, remnants, its remainders, and reminders. And she also noted that in some ways the past is in the past, in that there are events and people who already lived and events that already happened. But what a historian and what students and scholars can do is that we can ask new questions about the past and come up with new answers that matter for us today. And so in that, the question I have for us is on Christian engagement with race and politics. Amos chapter 5, verse 24 is one of the most frequently quoted scripture passages in the public forum. Many preachers and public figures have used the verse in sermons and other types of addresses. In May of 2018, the presiding Bishop Michael Curry cited the verse at the royal wedding in Windsor Castle when he shared about the power of redemptive love and its potential to change the world. He invited the royal couple, along with millions watching on televisions, computers, and smartphones all over the world. It's estimated 29.2 million in the United States and 1.9 billion worldwide, making it the most viewed non-sporting event in that calendar year. Bishop Curry invited them to imagine what homes and families and neighborhoods and communities could look like when love is the way. And in that, one of his lines was, "When love is the way," citing Amos chapter 5:24, "we will let justice roll down like a mighty stream and righteousness like an ever-flowing brook." Bishop Curry understood that he was preaching to two audiences that morning: the 600 or so persons at the wedding in Windsor Castle and billions more watching all over the world. 35 years before Bishop Curry, in the summer of 1963, a 34-year-old Black Baptist minister from Atlanta also referred to Amos chapter 5:24. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. evoked the verse in his address to over 200,000 people during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and millions more watching or listening on the television and radio. As he stood in front of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. King challenged all Americans to remember the promises of equality and freedom U.S. President Abraham Lincoln ushered in with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. 100 years had passed, but African Americans remained, in King's words, crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. Dr. King implored his fellow citizens to acknowledge these injustices and to enact changes to end them. He noted that critics often asked what it would take for Dr. King and other participants in the civil rights movement to be satisfied. What will it take for you all to be satisfied? King responded that they would not relent until African Americans had equal access to voting, employment, and public facilities, and they were no longer subject to, in his words, the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. King noted, "No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." James Henley Thornwell, a professor at Columbia Seminary from 1856 to 1862, when it was in Columbia, South Carolina, argued or preached and taught that Christians were responsible for exhibiting righteousness and enacting justice, but that it was to be done at an interpersonal level, from individual to individual, and that Christians, and in particular congregations and Christian institutions, were not called to social engagement that sought to upend or challenge larger structures and systems. His doctrine, which became known as the spirituality of the church doctrine, emphasized how a congregation was not, in his words, quote, a moral institute of universal good, end quote, and that it did not have a divine commission to construct society afresh, or in his words, rearrange the distribution of its classes. Rather, the church, capital C and perhaps lowercase c as well, as Thornwell saw it and taught it, was a strictly spiritual entity responsible for biblical teaching and administering the sacraments of baptism and communion. This doctrine of the spirituality of the church would persist long after Thornwell lived, in particularly the Southern Presbyterian denomination. The view there was that churches are called, and particularly pastors, as leaders of the churches, are ordained as ministers of word and sacrament. What we do best in the church is we preach and teach the word, we educate on the Bible, and we administer the sacraments of baptism and communion. It's important to note that this doctrine of the spirituality of the church was initially directly connected to the defense of slavery, which was the most significant social and political matter in Thornwell's day. An opposing view of how congregations should engage in politics came 100 miles away in Charleston, South Carolina. Angelina Emily Grimke opposed slavery after witnessing its brutality firsthand at school as a teenager. For her, her metanoia, or her transformative moment, was as a young teen student, maybe of 14 or 15 years of age. She saw that there was an enslaved young boy who was responsible for cleaning the classroom, and she saw when he was cleaning the classroom, his shirt had lifted up, and she saw the stripes and the bruises on his back from being beaten. And as a Christian and as a student, she thought that this cannot be the ways in which God has designed, created, envisioned, and wanted our world and our country and our society to be. She later wrote several theological works advocating fiercely for abolition, some in the perhaps most influential abolitionist periodical of its day, the Liberator, and others as treatises and pamphlets. One is perhaps her most influential, her 1836 appeal to Christian women in the American South. Unlike Thornwell, she pushed and she challenged and she prodded and she advocated for Christians and the church to speak and act on race and politics. You'll see there that she notes and she appeals to Protestantism as the protesting tradition. as a tradition. You'll see it there in the quote, what Presbyterians did in Scotland, what Methodists have done in England. And she also appeals to the examples of John Calvin and Martin Luther for how they opposed the unjust practices in their day, and that was very much tied to what it meant to be a Protestant, what it meant to be a person of Reformed faith, and how we should engage, or they should engage in the 1800s on the matter of slavery and other matters tied to race and politics. For Presbyterians and other U.S. Christians, this was one of the great divides in Christian ministry in the 19th century. How should congregations and preachers engage social and political matters? After the U.S. Civil War in Southern Presbyterianism, Thornwell's doctrine of the spirituality of the church persisted. To sum it up, for some Southern Presbyterians, it was this idea that congregations were not hospitals, we're not schools, we're not courts, and we're not legislative bodies. What is God's mission for pastors and for congregations? Again, to be ministers of word and sacrament, that's what we do best. Certainly, there are doctors, there are teachers, there are judges, there are lawyers, there are politicians that are in our pews and are in our congregations. So our call is simply to teach the Christian gospel and Christian principles as best as possible, that they might inform, and that there might be incremental change that happens, again, first from an interpersonal level, and that these individuals, these Christians, that God has called them to be responsible for any structural societal changes, political changes that needed to happen. At its best, perhaps, this doctrine of the spirituality of the church was an incremental movement. At its worst, particularly we see it in the pursuit of civil rights. It was a moral compromise that was used to remain silent on racial injustice. So as all of these things were going on, in addition to the civil rights movement, other Presbyterians and other Christians were wrestling with matters that tied to labor and tied to economic and justice. One example is Charles Stelzel. He was an interesting Presbyterian leader. He was unlike other Presbyterians in New York City in his day and age, in that he didn't grow up perhaps on the right side of the tracks. He grew up as a young teenager working in the labor industry and the kind of the clothing sweatshops, the meat packing industry in New York City. That was very much his world. He didn't have time as someone from the lower classes of society to get a formal education. So he was largely self-educated, but he was bright. And with that self-education, he had a call to ministry. So he wanted to be a pastor. So he wanted to go to seminary. So at first, as a New Yorker, he applied to the schools that were in his vicinity. He applied to Union Theological Seminary in NYC and Princeton Seminary in New Jersey. But he was denied admission from both because he did not meet the academic credentials. He didn't have the degrees, the academics that were necessary. So ultimately, he had a roundabout way to being ordained as a Presbyterian minister. He went to the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, and he studied there, and he became a pastor of a small congregation in St. Louis. And from that, though, he emerged as a leader that would work at the higher echelons of the Northern Presbyterian denomination by the early 1900s. And you'll see on the screen is something that he wrote in 1915. And so for him, his challenge to his Presbyterian colleagues was in some ways challenging the doctrine of the spirituality of the church, or challenging, as you can see there in the quote that I've pulled out, a kind of too narrow focus on the church, that in addition to individual salvation, that it's time, in his words, that we talk more about social salvation, that it's necessary for us, in addition to thinking about how to help people understand what it means to to be saved by God's grace. What it understands, let me share my screen again. Okay, I think I've got it. So what it means to do Christian ministry for persons who are living paycheck to paycheck, for persons who are wondering where their next meal is coming from persons who are suffering in their economic condition, for persons who are working too hard and too long in too dangerous conditions to make a living. Like, what does it mean for us to do ministry for these beloved persons? So for him, it has to be more than, in his words again, or his categories, individual salvation. But we need to talk about social salvation. We need to, as Christians, talk about and advocate for what are the necessary Christian conditions that are required for all people of all classes to flourish in life. And it's not enough to have this incremental kind of trickling approach to doing it, but that the church needs to be directly engaged in that kind of work. And so this is all that's going on. And let me conclude with two more kind of persons or stories, and then we'll open it up. One is Sarah Patton Boyle, and in her work, and I suppose these are kind of approaches that really wanted to engage how can Christians responsibly, thoughtfully, and effectively engage on race and politics to create a society that perhaps looks more like the kingdom or the kingdom of God. One such person was Sarah Patton Boyle. She was the daughter of an Episcopalian minister in Virginia who was married to and the spouse of a professor at the University of Virginia. And as the spouse of a professor, she also lived in Charlottesville and spent time with students. And her growing activism for civil rights emerged out of her friendship, advocacy of, you can see there on the screen, Gregory Swanson, the first Black law student at UVA. And so from there, she had a more public voice. And for her, some of what she wrote in The Desegregated Heart in 1962, interestingly, she was one of the 6 white persons that Dr. King cited in his letter from Birmingham City Jail as white allies who understood the struggle. He cited 3 white women and 3 white men. And Sarah Patton Boyle was one of the white women. She said, increasingly, the only way for whites like her to embrace African Americans as equal persons and to embody the spirit of Christian love was, we have to break out of what she called in this book, the white prisons that isolated them from genuine social relations with African Americans. She noted that if I'm in an all-white neighborhood, if I'm at an all-white workplace, if I'm in a all-white church, and if my world is surrounded by all-white people, even if I have the right values, and even if, in theory, I understand and I want the spirit of Christian love to bring all people together, it's not possible or it's not effective without genuine relationships. As white persons, one of her arguments was, it's not effective enough to speak for people of color or those who are on the margins, but that we have to speak with. And sometimes it requires us not to stand in front of, and not even to stand side by side, but to stand behind so that we can advocate together for justice. And so this requires, I think, an understanding in some communities then in the 1960s and perhaps even today, where I know and I'm aware that to preach or to teach about race and politics from the pulpit still in 2020 remains perhaps not a dangerous proposition, but a controversial proposition. But it's to note, for example, when we look back at the civil rights movement, that for African Americans like Dr. King, who were struggling and leading this charge, that race and politics and spirituality were not these distinct or separate categories, that they were all related. So for me, when I think about, for example, even the doctrine of the spirituality of the church, and those Christians today who want to hold on to that doctrine, what I would say is, what's your definition of spirituality? how can you help people be healed spiritually or live flourishing spiritual lives? I think it also entails social, economic, political condition, that these things are not separate categories. Perhaps, I don't even know if this is true, perhaps there are separate categories for people with privilege and people who can afford to separate these things. I don't even know if that's true, but it's to relate for so many people. These are not kind of optional pathways. And finally, I'll conclude with the Reverend Francis J. Grimke, who was the mixed race nephew of Angelina Emily Grimke, born of a white slaveholder and enslaved African-American woman in Charleston, South Carolina. He went on to study at Lincoln University in Philadelphia and Princeton Seminary in New Jersey, and became one of the leading Presbyterian ministers in the turn of the 20th century. He was the long-standing pastor of the historic 15th Street Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. And in 1909, he noted in a sermon, noting that he wondered and he questioned the absence of preaching against racism in white churches. He surmised that there have to be two reasons why there is this silence. One is cowardice. One is that his white colleagues know that the evils of racial prejudice are tenacious, ferocious, and real, but out of fear for what some congregants might think, there was a kind of silence. And the other was indifference. It's that they didn't know because they were so far removed from the realities that were ongoing in their own country or in their own town or in their own neighborhood. So he later said that even if he had lost faith in some of his white colleagues, he had not lost faith in God, and he had not lost faith in the power of the pulpit and the power of Christian teaching. And you can see there, and I'll close with that quotation of his, that this is the time for every pulpit to speak out and to speak in no uncertain tone, and the time when we as a people should get closer together and understand each other and prepare for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yu. So great. I want to take this time to open it up for questions and answers, and Sam White is going to lead us in that portion of the program. If you need a reminder about how to submit a question, please just click on the bottom of your screen. There should be something that says Q&A, and we'll see the questions on screen. We'll see a few coming in now, and Sam will lead us through that portion.
Hello, I just want to make sure everyone can hear me. My name is Sam White. I'm the Director of Admissions and Recruitment at Columbia Theological Seminary. I will be leading us in our question and answer portion. Brandon did mention how you can submit your questions. I'm just going to answer these questions live. They're gonna show up on your screen, and Dr. Yu will be able to respond to your questions. So the first one, what can the church do today to help ease the racial and political tension in America that is going on now?
Wow, that's a great and hard question. I think there are a lot of things Christians and congregations can do. I think at a local congregational level, I do think leaders in some contexts will need to move incrementally. That I think of for Presbyterians and other persons of Reformed faith, the Westminster Confession of Faith notes that Christ executed, awkward word they use, the offices of prophet, priest, and king in his earthly ministry. So I think for leaders in the church, we're called, I don't know about king, but to be priests and prophets. So priests are understood as those who kind of administered sacraments and taught and cared for people within the confines of the Hebrew Bible, the temple, and the church today. And that was kind of the priestly, or we might call pastoral function. And then, but there's also a prophetic function. The prophets were often persons who were outside of the temple, outside of the buildings, the sacred buildings, and in the streets and in the communities, proclaiming oftentimes hard words that people of faith didn't want to hear about God's judgment, about injustice. Again, think of Amos, to think of Micah, think of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the like. And so I think it requires an honest engagement with what is required for justice to happen. And I think one challenge remains to Sam and to all of us is that being compassionate and being kind is certainly a Christian virtue, but oftentimes those things end up being substitutes for the harder dialogue and changes that need to take place when we think about unjust, racialized, and racist practices that are happening in our country today.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Yu. Our next question from Courtney Pittman. As noted in the prayer at the beginning, this pandemic is greatly affecting those living in the margins. What do you see as the church's role during this time of COVID?
Yeah, a lot there too. I think, again, so for me, I'll try to answer this briefly. One helpful metaphor or picture I have when I think about the value of liberation theology or social justice or the kind of Christianity that really seeks to help and lead people in realities is I think of what liberation theology has helped me to think of is the story I share is that let's say I'm walking down the street from the market and I have 2 loaves of bread because that's what I've purchased for my family. And while walking home, I see someone else who has no loaves of bread and who is very hungry and asks me, may I have some bread for me and my family? What's my call as a Christian? Certainly my call as a Christian in that moment is to share my bread. If I can purchase 2 more loaves of bread fairly easily, I should just give both loaves of my bread to this person, go back to the market and get some more for my family. Or if I can't, at least share one of my loaves of bread with that person and then go on. I think, but then in addition to that, what liberation theology has helped me to see is that that's what Christ would want me to do. But how would Christ want me to ask? The question to say is, why doesn't this person have any bread in the first place? And what is God and what has Christ called me to do about that? In addition to sharing the bread that I have, it's asking, what are the systems? What are the laws? What are the practices? What are the societal injustices that are going on that are preventing people from flourishing in their daily lives? And what can I do about that? So certainly, right, Sam, and to all of us, it's to pray. But in addition to pray, it's asking God, how do I act? And in some ways, what gets challenging is it does require, how do I vote? It requires, who are the political candidates? Who is in office now? How are they creating or challenging laws that are creating these injustices? And then ultimately it's, how do I share and inform, if I'm a religious leader, others? Perhaps again, not in a partisan way, but to help inform very much that these are the realities. I think it's hard when Christians say, I want my ministry to be apolitical. In some ways, I understand where that's coming from because it can be a very divisive issue. And to talk a little bit about a policy or a politician, it can, in a 20-minute sermon, that one line could be all that people go away with. But at the same time, I think what I see from the civil rights movement and the abolitionist movement was the recognition that politics is a spiritual matter, that politics is a gospel matter, that politics are the levers by which kind of change or existence happens in this country and in the world. So we have to figure out ways to inform, educate, instruct, and engage.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Yu. The next question is from Alan in Bangalore, India. I'm sorry, Bangalore, India. Thanks very much, Dr. Yu. He's asking if cowardice or indifference is also deep-seated prejudice. So I guess he's asking your perspective as a church, someone who's well-versed in church history. Can those two things be seen as the same?
Yes, I think it's to discern and recognize if in a particular context, a position of indifference can be cowardly in the sense that there are other options available. Like, I don't necessarily need to be indifferent about, for example, let's say just at a local level, like how are my neighbors doing in this time of pandemic? Certainly, I can be indifferent to their concerns because I don't know, but it would be cowardly if I'm indifferent because I choose not to know. So in that way, largely, I think certainly there are times where perhaps indifference is an authentic response, but it's to discern when other times indifference is kind of an ideological, fraudulent thing.
This next question is actually from President Van Dyke. Dr. Yu, are there still those church leaders and theologians who want to defend the doctrine of spirituality of the church? I admit that I assume this was on the trash heap of history.
Yeah, I don't know in terms of, I think a present day assessment could be a helpful another hour for all of us to engage. What I can say is I do think there are those sympathizers, perhaps historically, in terms of not wanting to kind of take it to the trash heap, or because they want to, again, as I tried to allude to, note that is it possible for there to be that kind of incremental trickle up kind of transformative change? Like, can it be possible that a congregation that focuses on spirituality the way they understood it, it can affect church members, and they can go and they can affect their neighbors, and their neighbors can affect other neighbors, and so on, such that that's the way kind of societal transformation happens, rather than trying to address kind of structural issues from up top. I think a lot of us would say that's a kind of, I don't know, maybe false dichotomy, right? That it's, of course, we should do both and that in some ways, neither is sufficient in and of itself. That we need to persuade neighbors and do the local kind of engagement. But at the same time, we need to think clearly about political structural engagement as well. So in that way, I think some want to, I don't know about defend, but say, is there something about this doctrine of the spirituality of the church that can be helpful?
Next question is from Rachel Crilly. In terms of historical scholarship, is it better to look at the individual's theological framework or larger denominational views? How do you try to separate them?
Yeah, I think that's a complicated question, in that different traditions, denominations, ecclesial bodies, non-denominational, everyone I think operates a little bit differently. So maybe perhaps I can hone in on Presbyterianism, not as the kind of denomination par excellence, but just as kind of one anecdote, one way to answer it. I think so certainly it is the tension of what's happening at higher levels of ecclesial judicatory kind of movements. For Presbyterians, it's congregations and sessions, the elders that govern over or shepherd over a congregation, and that these congregations are all formed into a presbytery. And a presbyteries, maybe on 20 or 30, form into different geographical synods. And the synods all comprise General Assembly, which meets biannually and makes kind of decisions on polity and the like. So the question there is, like how does it work? So in certain ways, it's like in some ways, congregations are maybe not autonomous, but really people of faith do as they will and act and discern faithfully as best as possible at a local level, with little attention paid to what's happening at the higher levels. But at the same time, higher levels, when they make kind of decisions on big matters, I think for the Presbyterian Church USA, it came several years ago with the increasing push and ultimately the polity practice of the genuine inclusion of queer and trans persons to ordained ministry. So in that way, it does, like what happened at the local level affected what happened up here. But at sometimes for some, what happened up here really ended up transforming what happens down here. I don't mean down in a bad way. But so I think that's to engage, but it's certainly, again, to discern between perhaps what happens organizationally and what happens individually.
All right, I think we have time for a few more questions. This next question is from Miss Jane Fahey, who's also our board chair-elect. And so this question, Dr. Yu says, would you agree with the premise of Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, that it is misguided to think that racism is at root a problem of ignorance and hate, requiring a transformation of the heart? Instead, Kendi argues the root problem is one of power that enacts racist policies and then promotes racist ideas to justify the policies. So we must first work on the policy.
I do agree. And I wish we had more time for kind of opening everyone to talk. I think, so let's agree with the premise that the root problem is one of power, power that enacts racist policies. So we have to work on the policy end. So then the next kind of step is, how do we help all Christians, particularly Christians who are on the, I don't know, the higher or the powerful side of power? How do we help them get at this matter such that it requires more than a transformation of individual hearts, but it requires really addressing policies? And I think in many ways it requires a kind of education. What are the policies that are in place in my town? What are the policies that are in place in the district where my congregation resides? How are policies helping or more likely hurting persons of color? And then how do we kind of act and do something about that? So I do, but I don't want to, I think what gets tricky and what gets hard in Christian context is when we say that the transformation of the heart isn't all that's required. Right, Sam? Because I see you and others, it's like this sense of, that feels almost like blasphemous. Right? What do you mean that transforming hearts, that's what we should be doing as Christians. That's what our ministry needs about. So you're saying transforming hearts doesn't matter. Then you sounds like you just want to be another social organization. Sounds like it sounds like you want to be more like the NAACP, or you want to be more than like the social work agency that's down the street than the church. I think sometimes, Sam, and to all of us, that happens and there's a weariness. So I think one is to, again, I think it's not to be indifferent to that kind of response, because it's a reality, not just a perception, but then it's to think carefully about how we respond pastorally. But sometimes pastorally ends up being nicely in a way that just kind of pushes the conversation or sweeps it under the rug. But how do we really respond pastorally and incrementally with authentic relationship that gets to change? And what's hard sometimes is a leader can be 10 steps ahead of the genuine loving people they want to serve. And so how do I help people see what I see? So again, it's not necessarily like maybe to adopt my viewpoint, but how do I help them see what I see so that we can have a genuine dialogue and maybe even disagree within that dialogue about policy and power?
This next question from Mr. S.C. Roosevelt Harris. Dr. Yu, can you please differentiate between individual and social salvation? And what is the role, I'm trying to, let's see, what is the role of spirituality and being a Christian when thinking about secularism and or living in a secular world?
Yeah, that's a good and hard question. I think let me try to capture Charles Stelzel's understanding of individual and social salvation. So in some ways in his day, he was criticizing or critiquing a focus on individual salvation that was centered around converting people and helping souls get to heaven and the kingdom of God, if you will, up there. And so he wasn't saying that that's bad, but he was saying it's too narrow in that it wasn't focused enough on bringing the kingdom of heaven down to earth and not helping people get up to Jesus, if you will, but helping Jesus's teaching and Jesus's presence live on earth.
Yeah.
So again, right, Sam, he was thinking about the meat packing industries and the clothing sweatshops that he worked in as a poor youth. And he was thinking, what needs to happen here is better wages. What needs to happen here is better working conditions. And ultimately, that's the kind of social salvation that would then help people live flourishing lives and help people kind of hear and understand and live out the gospel.
That's good. Next question from David Logeman. Dr. Yu, thank you so much for this lecture. It is timely and makes me think about the question of progress. I am struck that the words and writings you cited are still relevant today, and that in some ways we in the church have made shockingly little progress in addressing racial and economic inequality. What kind of progress do you think is possible for the church? Also, what specific contributions do you think the church can make that are different than other sectors of society?
I think the first, I think of Reinhold Niebuhr, kind of moral theologian, first half of the 20th century, who was also very involved in the labor movement. So he wrote in The Irony of American History, I think 1952. He said how change happens when he looks back at history is that it actually doesn't happen in a kind of linear upward movement, but he talks about how it's a kind of zigzag, that it happens up and down, and that change doesn't happen through this kind of linear, smooth process of progressive movement, but that it happens through a drama of conflict, right? When he notes the zigzag at every step of the way, think of abolition, that it was not this kind of smooth thing, but it was a zigzag, in fact, the Civil War, and that's how to understand kind of what's happening. So one kind of, I think, positive, but I hope not too romanticized way, Sam and David, for all of us to look at it as if, I hope that it's not a kind of, okay, so there's a lot of conflict now, but it's good, because that means change is going to happen. So let me just sit back and see it happen. But it's to recognize, how can I get involved in this drama of conflict? And how can I be a participant, and how can I discern what's the, if you will, right side of history?
Yeah.
Or if that's too kind of Lin-Manuel Miranda Hamiltonian, what's kind of the, like, how does God want me to fulfill Micah chapter 6, to walk humbly, act justly, and live faithfully before God? How do I get on the right side? If there's a conflict, there's a right side and there's a wrong side. Yeah. How do I get on the right side? And I hope that that's what the church can offer with humility.
All right. And our final question. Hi, Dr. Yu. As a historian, what encourages and worries you about the witness of the church in the last few years?
I think it's to note that certainly some of what is existing or what is happening in churches over the last few years, if we're honest, or let's just say me, I don't want to use the royal we. If I'm honest, it is disturbing. Whether it be implicit or explicit, the nativism, the ethnocentrism, the racism, the ostracism that is occurring, it's not. I don't think it's very helpful. But at the same token, I think there are also, and to never forget, that there are Christians, people of faith, communities of faith that are doing their best to live faithfully and to act out God's call. And there are people not only in all different kinds of churches. I don't want to just kind of focus on one. And so again, so that, I don't know, that brings hope. Again, I want to be cautious in that. I want to be, right, Romans 12, Sam, I think it says, don't be conformed, but be transformed. Romans 1 and 2, we like those verses. But then verse 3, I think it says, be sober-minded in your judgment. So I don't want to be too romantic or too idealist. Let's focus on how these 5 churches are doing awesome things and they're going to win the day. But it's to say, let's focus on how these churches are doing the right thing and how can I get involved? Because I know that it's going to be really hard.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Yu. Thank everyone for their participation, for all of your questions. If you did not have an opportunity to ask questions, we do encourage you to continue to join us. We will be having these First Friday lectures every first Friday of the month. So the next one will be the first Friday in the month of June. We do want to remind everyone that our application deadlines have been extended for our master's levels degrees, as well as for our D-Min and our D-Admin. Please contact our admissions office. You can contact me directly at sam.white@ctsnet.edu. Again, thank President Van Dyke. I want to thank Brandon Maxwell. I want to thank Dr. Yu. I want to thank Katie Ricks. I want to thank everyone who was a part of making these faculty lectures possible. We want to thank each and every one of you who attended, our alumni, our faculty, our staff, our admitted students, our prospective students, friends of CTS. We are so thankful. We look forward to this hour with you at the beginning of every month. And so there will be more opportunities for those who have been admitted to CTS or those who are prospective students to engage with our admissions staff, to ask questions. We will be in contact with you soon about those opportunities. So we thank you again, and we wish you well as you enter your weekend. All right, to you all, we're signing off. You be blessed. We will talk to you soon.